Most important threats to coastal populations and infrastructure around the world. Roughly 3 billion people, and half of the world's population, live within 200 kilometers of the coastline, and they're all at risk from coastal erosion. We know that coastal erosion is a major problem in Saldanha Bay, particularly around Langebaan, also in Big Bay, between Speerwelle and the entrance to the Lagoon. We've seen losses of up to 100 meters of beach in places in Langebaan and Saldanha over the years, and up to 40 meters in just a single decade. The main drivers of coastal erosion in this area are twofold, at least I think so. One is what I call climate variability or climate change, and I'll touch on why I think that's important now. And secondly, development, or at least inappropriate development in the coastal zone, and here I'm thinking about port development, dredging, piers, groins, dredge spoil disposal, all can affect coastal erosion. And I'll show you how that plays out in Saldanha Bay and Langebaan. Quite a bit of effort was put into controlling coastal erosion back in 2000s, 2003, 2004. They built a number of groins on Langebaan Beach. They built a massive rock revetment along the front of the beach there. That's what it looks like. It's pretty awful. The groins are made of these giant sandbags, which they placed out on Langebaan Beach. It was necessary. The beach was disappearing at an alarming rate, and it was a very necessary intervention. More recently, Club Mykonos, Paradise Beach, they've had to build a massive wooden structure to try and protect the dunes. You can basically see historically the beach used to run kind of at that level, and now has dropped down 2 or 3 meters. And without that wooden structure, that dune would simply fall into the sea. Sorry, I think I went backwards there. It became apparent in the early 2000s that shoreline erosion was a major problem in Saldanha Bay. A guy by the name of Stephen Luger, who used to work for the CSIR in those days, did a lot of work looking at shoreline erosion here. And these are some of the pictures from his work from the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 2000s. You can see how the beach, these are old aerial photographs, you can see how the beach has eroded there. And in 2003, before they constructed the groins, you can just see how much beach, several hundred, up to 100 meters and more, had been lost from there. The houses were about to fall into the sea there. And he did a modeling study to try and understand what was the best solution to try and mitigate against this erosion. What could they do? And he built a numerical model which he used to test different solutions. And what he discovered from his modeling work is that building groins is probably the best thing you can do. Building a groin perpendicular to the shoreline going out to sea, it interrupts that longshore movement of currents and waves and reduces the erosion. So that's what he suggested, and that's ultimately what the municipality did. He built the 2 groins there, and then also built that rock revetment along that section of shoreline, and it was highly successful. It limited erosion quite significantly along that beach, and it persists to this day. The groins are looking a bit tatty now, the sandbags are tearing open, they're falling apart, but the beach is still there. So it was a successful intervention, but it's coming to the end of its life. Other people that have worked on shoreline erosion in Saldanha Bay is a guy called Burgard Fleming. Starting in the 1970s, he was working for the CSIR, and he was advising the National Ports Authority in those days about development of the port. This was prior to the development of the Port of Saldanha, and he did a lot of work on sediment distribution, wave energy in Saldanha Bay, and he was the one that actually discovered this massive rocky abrasion, what he called an abrasion platform in the bay area of very little sediment, maybe a fine veneer, sort of shallow veneer of sediment across most of Saldanha Bay. Interestingly, they needed to build the causeway that linked Marcus Island to the mainland, and they needed a whole lot of sand to build that up. And so they went off looking for sand. Where can they get some sand for this? And they thought, we'll just grab it out of Saldanha Bay. And they went out there and they really struggled to find sand. But they did find a patch of sand over there. There was quite a depth of big block of sand over there, which they dredged out. And they also found a big block of sand here at the entrance to Langebaan Lagoon. The source of the sand is quite interesting. Sand gets blown up onto the beaches, onto the shore, all the way up from north of Cape Town, Silverstrand, Tableview, and that sand gets blown up into the shore and then gets blown along the shore and then eventually finds its way into Langebaan Lagoon. But people don't like it when sand blows into their houses, so they planted acacia all the way up and down the west coast, and that stabilized a lot of that sand movement. And so the amount of sand going into the lagoon has greatly been reduced. But never mind, there was an abundance of sand there, and they were really, when they built this causeway, they underestimated the extent of the wave action on that causeway, and they pumped sand and they pumped sand, and it just washed away. So they piled rocks and they piled rocks and they pumped more sand and they pumped more sand, and they ended up dredging out 10 times as much sand as they ever thought they needed, and that's why we arrived at this 25 million tons of sand that was dredged out of Saldanha Bay, Langebaan Lagoon back in the day, because that was used to try and build this causeway. And what Burgard Fleming came back when he saw, he's been working in the Netherlands for most of his life since he left the CSIR, but he became aware of the issue of erosion on the beaches in Langebaan, and he says, I think the port development has something to do with that, and that if you dig a giant hole over here, it's going to change wave energy patterns in the bay. So what happens with wave energy is most of the waves come from the southwest, from the Southern Ocean, come up into the entrance of Saldanha Bay, and as they come into Saldanha Bay, they spread out. And as they spread out like that, the wave energy drops. So you still see quite high, big waves at the opposite the entrance to the bay, but as you get towards the edges of the bay, wave energy dissipates because of that, what we call refraction. As the waves spread out, the energy spread out over a much larger area. But when you go and dig a big hole, what happens is the waves tend to refract back on themselves. So they start pointing back together again. And what he was able to, he estimated that by digging the hole over here, that it would have increased wave energy along Langebaan Beach by about 60%. So he said, I think this has got a lot to do with why the beaches are starting to erode there, why they didn't used to erode. It's because we went and dug a big hole there in the 70s. It's taken a long time for that impact to play out. He didn't have any evidence of that at the time. He knew they dug a big hole there, but he didn't have any information or bathymetry surveys to prove that. But our esteemed colleague, Jacques, our chairman of the trust, and his colleagues at Stellenbosch University did some really interesting work on that. They had data from the South African Navy hydrographer. They did detailed bathymetry surveys of the bay in 1957, which was prior to when they built the port, and again in 1977. And so there's the 1957 picture, no causeway, no port terminal. There's the 1977 picture, terminal is in place, causeway is in place. And they said, well, let's subtract this one from that one and see what the resultant looks like. And here, the blue areas are where that have become shallower in that over that time period. And yes, not surprisingly, the area around the causeway got a lot shallower, and a couple of other areas you see got a little bit shallower. The red areas are the ones that got deeper. And yes, this is the shipping channel. They dredged a massive shipping channel so that the big ore carriers could safely approach the iron ore terminal, anchor alongside. They had to dig a big channel there. Some accretion over there where they built the multi-purpose terminal and the other parts of the terminal. But interestingly, where Burgard Fleming said they dug the sediment out, yes, there's a big hole over there, but there's a much bigger hole over there. So he was onto something. That hole persisted much long after it was dredged, And I suspect he was entirely correct in saying this is why some of the beaches in Langebaan have eroded over time. And we've got some really interesting data to validate that. The municipality, starting in 1994, started monitoring beach profiles along this section of beach. And I've divided it into Langebaan North Beach, which is that section just from the groin northwards, and then Langebaan South Beach, which is the section of groin southwards. And this data runs from 1994 to 2000. And the orange bars, the ones that point down, that's just the change from one year to the next. And that is the volume of sand that disappeared from the beach in that year. And you can see at the peak in about 2000, we lost about 150,000 meters cube of sand from the beach in 1 year. But every single year, when those surveys were done, there was massive amounts of sand eroding off that beach. And I think because of increased wave energy there. And with Langebaan South Beach, the pattern is exactly the opposite. The bars are mostly positive. This is where sand is being deposited, but the volumes are much smaller. You can see 30,000 meters cubed there. So the beach was eroding here and depositing over here. And some of the sand from here was being deposited over here, but most of it was just being carried offshore. Then Stephen Luger came along and said, let's build some groins, and they duly did so. And look what happened to the beaches. We had a massive increase in the deposition of sediment on the beach. That was part of the beach nourishment process. They went and dredged more sand out of offshore here and dumped it on the beach. So we had a massive spike in the increase in the width of the beach and the amount of sand on the beach. But this intervention was very successful in that the beach basically stabilized. There was some years we had accretion, some years erosion, but it was pretty much, it's been pretty stable since that time. And Langebaan South Beach, major accretion before the groins, there the groins in red. Big loss of sediment there, but since that time, pretty much stable. So a very successful intervention, and hats off for him for coming up with that. Unfortunately, those observations stopped in 2019, but this shows that that same data, this is the width of the beach decreasing from 1994 up to 2003, then beach nourishment and stabilization up until 2019. Langebaan South Beach, a little bit of increase in the width of the beach from 94 till 2003, and then slight decrease, but now kind of stable. We haven't got that much data since that time because the survey stopped in 2019. But if you go and have a look at the groins now, those sandbags, they lasted very well, but they're starting to fall apart. They've got holes in them. They're washing up on the beach. And given a few more years, I suspect these groins are no longer going to exist, and we're going to revert back to the problem we had many years ago. Some other work has been done on beach erosion in this area. If you look carefully at the map here, this is focusing on 16 Mile Beach outside of Saldanha Bay. This is work by Jennifer Murray from the University of Pretoria. She used historical aerial photographs to look at beach erosion along 16 Mile Beach. And I've taken just one of the spots along the beach here, and you can see how she's mapped shoreline profiles. This was in 1937 is the red line. That's where the shoreline was back in 1937, 1960, 77, 2005, and then it sort of stabilized there. But there's a reduction in beach width of about 80 meters over that initial period, and then stabilizing since that time. So beach erosion is not restricted to Langebaan, it's also going on outside here. We don't know why there was such a massive erosion going on in the earlier period, and then suddenly it seems to have stopped. Don't quite know why, but it is clearly, well, actually I do know why, and I'll tell you why now, but it is an interesting pattern. This is also a beach profile over time, and this is the time stamped from 1940 to present day, red indicating erosion, blue being accretion, and you can see that most of the red is on the southern portion of the beach here, eroding over there, and looks like mostly accreting up there. But clearly, it's a problem. It's not restricted to Langebaan. It's going on all over the place here. Which is why we decided, as part of the work for the Trust, is to try and institute a new beach monitoring program to try and understand how bad is the erosion, how is it changing over time. And we want to use satellite data for this purpose. We've got satellite, they started launching satellites back in the 1970s, but there were only a handful of satellites in the sky in those days, and the imaging, the cameras that were mounted on those satellites were very poor, and the resolution is quite low. We've got imagery with an 80-meter resolution pixel size, which is very, very crude imagery. But since that time, technology's evolved. From the sort of 1980s onwards, we start getting higher resolution imagery, sort of 30-meter resolution. Now we're down to kind of 10-meter resolution. They can read your number plate from space now. Which is great for us because we can use this data to monitor changes in beach profiles. We also found this a neat little tool called the Shoreline Analysis Extraction Tool, which is a technique developed by this fellow here, a Spanish guy, for using satellite data for monitoring changes in beaches. Takes the satellite data, extracts it, and we can use it to monitor beach profiles. As I said just now, satellite imagery back to the 70s is not great, but from 1985 onwards is good enough, so we started using that. And I also mentioned the revisit frequency. In those days, there were only 2 satellites flying around the Earth, so they didn't come past South Africa very often. So we got maybe 1 usable image per year in the period 1985 to 2000. But from from 2000 onwards to 2015, we had at least annual satellite passes from data we were able to use. And now, in the last 10 years, we've got twice, 2-3 times a year, we've got enough satellite passes to be able to get quite a detailed picture of changes in beach using this data. And this is what we've done with the data. We separated it into 3 different periods, 1985 to 2000. We looked at 5-year increments in changes in beach. The second period we looked at is 2000 to 2015. We looked at annual changes. And then from 2015 onwards, we've actually been able to look at it on a seasonal basis. But nice, the data matches exactly what our surveys, our land-based surveys were able to tell us. Massive, the red is erosion, the green is accretion, and you can see there very clearly that satellite data is telling us, well, yes, what we already knew, the beaches were eroding there. North Langebaan Beach, massive erosion. South Langebaan Beach, a little bit of accretion. Up north around Club Mykonos, this is from Langebaan going northwards, you can see quite a bit of erosion over there, some loss of beach. North there, Lynch's Clip, quite a lot of erosion, we know there's a problem there. Calypso Beach, and then here, this is Paradise Beach, and we can see quite a lot of erosion happening in that period. So sorry, that is the first period, this is the second period. Reduced erosion here because the groins are in place, but we see in this period very little erosion in the 1985 to 2000, not much erosion on Paradise Beach, but in the 2000 to 2015 period, a lot of erosion, big problem. And that's exactly when Mykonos responded by putting those wooden structures in there to try and save the dunes. Going forward to the last period, 2015 to 2024, nice accretion on the beaches here around Langebaan. Groins are still working, it's great. Some erosion in various places up here because we've got no beach protection there. Paradise Beach, still, well, that's where the wooden structures are, the green bits working. No structures in the middle here, and that's where the beach is eroding. If anyone's been along Speervallei Beach recently, rocks are all sticking out the sand, the dunes are falling into the sea. It's a huge problem there. So this is a really neat, effective and cheap way of monitoring beach erosion. We don't have to send someone out with a theodolite trying to measure beach profiles. We can simply grab that satellite data, it's free, and put an effort to analyze it. it does give us very nice pictures of what's going on, and we can try and use that to try and forecast, at least monitor in future what's going on the beaches here, because it is a huge problem. But why are the beaches eroding so fast here? We know that the dredging that was done as part of the harbour construction played a role, but certainly that erosion is not limited to those areas. And we started thinking about climate change and what role is that playing. So we looked at changes in wave height over the last 70 years, in fact. We've got measured wave height data. Transnet has a wave rider buoy at the entrance to Saldanha Bay. It's been in place since the 1980s, and we've got some data on that. And we also used data from the European Centre for Medium Weather Forecasting. They use satellite data. They run the global climate models. They tell you what weather's going to be like tomorrow. And not only can they run those models forward in time, but they can also run them backwards in time and forecast what historic weather conditions were like and what historic wave conditions were like. And we extracted data for the Saldanha region from these models, and we got quite an alarming picture. This is what we call significant wave height. It's the height of the average height of the highest 1/3 of all the waves over any particular period of time. And you can look at that significant wave height back in the 1960s is the blue color. Average significant wave height was just under 2 meters. And that has rolled forward now to about 2.5 meters in the present day. The yellow line is the most recent one. And you can see the numbers there. Back in the 1960s, maximum significant wave height, so that's kind of up here, not average, but maximum significant wave height was around 4 meters. And we've got figures for every decade since then. 4, 5, 6, 5.5, 6, just over 6, coming on for 6.5. That wave height has increased by nearly 50% over the last 70 years. That's massive. We think it's linked to climate change, increased storm intensity, increased wave intensity coming with those storms. And the time period for the data that is available for the wave rider buoy is much shorter, but shows a very similar pattern with significant wave heights in the 80s, 5.26, 5.36, 6, 8. Quite a significant increase, and we think that is what is causing some of the beach erosion here in Saldanha Bay and Langebaan. And so that means that it's not going to go away. It's going to get worse, if anything. And Donald Trump, unfortunately, who rules the world, doesn't believe in climate change. And he's going to reduce funding for climate mitigation, which means we're in real trouble. So we do need to think about interventions that are going to mitigate against shoreline erosion here in Saldanha Bay. Somebody needs to get in there and relook at the groins in Langebaan Beach, rebuild those groins, repair those groins. Maybe we need some groins further north, but otherwise your houses are going to be in the sea pretty soon. That's all I want to say. I'm going to give you a quick summary of what I've told you now. We see development pressure is ratcheting up in Saldanha Bay, Langebaan Lagoon. We need to be vigilant. We need to increase our attention. Groundwater seems to be good. We're in a good space there. Water quality, gosh, they're at the best levels I've seen since I've been monitoring here, certainly for fecal coliforms. Great for tourism, means the water's safe for people to swim here. Sediment quality has improved dramatically over the years, and we're seeing those impacts playing out in the biological communities. Maybe not so much in Small Bay, but certainly Langebaan Lagoon and Big Bay. Coastal erosion is a huge problem. I think it's our next biggest threat. It's something we really need to give attention to. Benthic macrofauna, those are the bugs that live in the sediment, seem to be improving, maybe not so much in Small Bay, but certainly in the other areas of the bay, great positive. Fish populations are very variable, but there are some species we need to be concerned about. Particularly Small Bay, we need to be concerned there. We do need some management action there. Birds breeding on the islands and the lagoons are declining. There's not a lot we can do about it, but we need to at least try. And I didn't really talk about marine aliens. They're increasing. You heard what Alison said, new alien species. We've picked up 7 new alien species in the last 5 years. It's a big problem. We need to be careful. We need to think about it. So overall, I think we're doing well, but don't take your eyes off the road. And that's it for me. Thank you.